Stream is going good. Oh wow, hello. It's we're on the stage. This is so cool.
It's even harder to see y'all now.
This is very cool though.
When folks smile, I can see their teeth, and that's about it.
Okay. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, hello.
We're gonna do a live episode of the Queer Sex Ed podcast. If you haven't listened to the show before, welcome. This is your first episode. It's a great one.
We say that about every episode. I hope they're all actually great.
And I want to start by saying thank you to Maria and to Emory Pride for bringing us in. I want to say thank you to the School of Public Health and School of Nursing for bringing us in. Let's give them a round of applause really quick. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm not clapping loudly because I'm worried about the
Yes, we're still, it's less hot than it was. Sound check wise, like raise your hand if you're struggling to hear us up a little bit more, or thumbs up like it's good. It's good. Okay, it's good. Great. Wonderful. Okay, hit us with the sound. Let's go.
Oh my goodness.
Oh no.
That's okay.
Okay, that's okay. Mute the computer, and I will edit it in post. But
many things get edited in post.
Imagine the guitar sound that opens the show, and all the intro stuff that we won't have here because I don't have the script with me. And here we are. Hello, welcome. Thank you. I'm so glad you all are here.
Thank you for making noise.
Thank you, Emory. Thank you for having us. So hello and welcome to Queer Sex Ed. This is a sex-positive podcast where we center queer and trans voices in discussions of sexual health, pleasure, and BDSM.
This is episode 65, Dating Preferences, live at Emory University.
Woo! My name is Sarah, and I use she, her, and hers pronouns. And with me, as always, in person, is my co-host.
And this is Jay, and I use these, and zers pronouns.
We're usually separated by so much distance. So
thousands
really
of miles.
Oh, I meant to take my hair down. Wait, look at,
there you go.
It looks very good. Yeah, it looks very
Quick
good.
zhuzh.
Thank you. Yes.
We're having a zhuzh. There was going to be makeup. There is no makeup. It was too complicated.
So just a few logistical things before we get started. We're going to do questions later on in the show. We have a shorter show content than usual, which, as you all know, means it's 2 hours. Just kidding. We're gonna try to stick to a shorter show.
We're aiming for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
I can guarantee nothing.
And have plenty of time for questions after. We are going to have a microphone set up if you want to come up and ask your question. We'll put it on the floor up here once we're ready to start. But we also have pieces of paper that are going to be passed out. So if you want to write your question on a slip of paper, we'll collect those before we're going to do the question part, just so that you don't have to out yourself, or you can ask an anonymous question. And if you ask crappy things, you'll get a crappy answer. But for the most part, any question is a good question, unless it's bigoted and bad.
Like, should Nazis have rights? Not a legitimate question.
Nope.
The answer is no.
The answer is no.
Moving on.
So we're here to talk about dating preferences. And we always start with a word of the show. We usually banter, but we did a lot of pre-show. So I think we're good on the banter side.
I mean, we could try. I don't know.
Nah, it's okay.
It would be forced right now.
So question slips. I already did that part. Okay, great. So our word of the show that we're going to talk about is sapiosexual.
Actually a word.
Which is actually a word. Hooray!
Which maybe
we
happens 30% of the time.
Yeah, it's usually a phrase. But word of the show is such a good name. So Jay, you love defining things.
I do.
And we would love to have you define what sapiosexual means in person.
So I'm using the technical definition, and we are going to talk about why this is a problem. But it basically means a person who finds intelligence sexually attractive or arousing. And it's sometimes talked about as kind of the thing that is the most attractive or arousing about someone is their intelligence, or that it's the only thing that's found to be attractive or arousing. I want to name before we get into this, because this is going to be a fairly critical word of the show, given personal experience, that there are definitely people who use this, and I'm probably some who are listening, maybe some in this audience, who use this to mean the people that I pursue relationships with are people who I have an intellectual connection with. Cool. Yeah. Great. That's an important connection for some people. That is not how I hear most people using it.
Yeah, and we'll get into that piece. I want to note something is about my asexuality and my demisexuality more specifically. I really understood that it wasn't actually about intelligence
Mhm.
necessarily, but it was more that I needed that emotional connection with somebody first, and sometimes deep conversations or intellectual, like, talking about stuff or doing activism together or that kind of thing, like, made me attracted to somebody. And sapiosexual was the word that I used for that for a little while, and because of reasons that we're going to talk about here, I don't use that word anymore. But I just want to speak to the fact that, like, language changes, language has different interpretations in different places, and just because a community or some people might be using a word in a really problematic way, if you've listened to, like, our bisexual doesn't mean transphobic episode. You've heard some of this stuff before, but just because some people use an identity in a bigoted way or in a way that's harmful doesn't mean that everybody using that is automatically a bad person. But we want to offer you some different perspectives on the idea of sapiosexuality and also what it actually means to be attracted to intelligence,
Mhm.
and how that's sort of mitigated by our culture, by our white supremacist heteropatriarchy, and it's going to kind of be a lead in to talk about dating preferences as a whole, which again is going to be our main topic of the show.
Yeah. So, how I most often hear this used is by mostly cisgender heterosexual men to get backdoor access to queer spaces. So, for example, I cannot tell you the number of straight men that I still have trying to poke at me on OkCupid, which is never going to go well for y'all. It's not going to work, um, because I don't want to be seen by straight people. But then they use sapiosexual to get around that, so that
Hmm.
they're not blocked anymore. Or there have been kind of queer only parties or queer only spaces or queer only dungeons that cis het men have decided that they are entitled to, and then say, "Oh well, I'm sapiosexual, so I should be allowed in this space too." Um, no. Just no. Like, not every space is intended for every person, and it's not okay.
Yeah. I also want to say too that, like, sometimes the people who are doing that might have other queer identities that they
Yeah.
are nervous to explore, that they're afraid to be public about, and it seems like a more accessible way in, or it seems like something that's more socially acceptable for them, or something
Mhm.
that's going to get them less shit, basically. Um,
I will give you so much shit.
and and um, and really, what it comes down to is doing that self work, if that is what's going on for you, and figuring out if I really feel pulled to these queer spaces, if I really feel like I need to be there, and like that's something that is necessary for me, then maybe there's more going on there for you instead of kind of stopping at this surface level identity and saying, like, well, I'm still mostly interested in dating, like, white, thin, conventionally attractive looking cisgender women, but I also want to be able to be in these spaces. The reality is sometimes there are spaces that just don't fit because marginalized people need to have a place to be away from the
Mhm.
harms of cis, het, straight culture.
Well, and also, like, trying to get access to queer women in
Mhm.
ways that, like, gives you an in so that you can try to prove something so that you're, like, getting over a hump in some way, which is gross, or approaching trans folks in a super fetishizing way, is often another way that, like, again, folks are kind of getting into spaces, and lots of folks use lots of different ways. This is just one that is particularly irksome.
Yeah, exactly. Um, it's also often used to demonstrate how much better or more enlightened somebody is, rather than an actual sexual orientation. And so it's this sort of like, I'm above needing to be attracted to bodies, like I just am
I'm
attracted to
sorry.
smart minds or whatever else.
I'm sorry
Um,
if you are not attracted to really, really hot bodies. Bodies are great. Bodies are cool. Bodies do lots of really interesting things. Also, things that I wish mine didn't do sometimes, because bodies are also weird and gross. But, like, bodies are cool, and sex is so much better deeply embodied than it was when I was not deeply embodied.
Yeah. I think another thing about this too is that most of the time when people are using this word, they're still dating people who look very similar, and that looks is, like I said, usually like thin, white, conventionally attractive cis women. And so if somebody's using this identity as their term in like a real way, what it would look like is having really diverse sexual partners, really diverse dating partners, like people who have really different body shapes, really different race and culture backgrounds, really different trans identities or whatever else, right? Because if you're only attracted to somebody's mind, if you're only attracted to somebody's intelligence, then you would think that that would then connect across lots of different identity groups. But as we're going to talk about in the dating preferences piece too, usually what that is it's code for conventionally attractive within sort of white cis society.
Hmm. And not like, and either not disabled or not visibly disabled.
Hmm.
And right. So really what we're kind of dancing around right now, which I don't know why we're dancing around it other than I just kind of separated things out weird in the way that I was thinking about this, is at its core is deeply embedded ableism, classism, and often racism and white supremacy, right? Like intelligence in and of itself is a eugenicist project. It is a project that has been used to marginalize, minoritize, forcibly sterilize, institutionalize, in prisons and in psychiatric hospitals, push to the margins literally and hide from society folks who were not classified as appropriately intelligent. And every single one of these intelligence tests that we have is based on middle to upper class white norms, so that there's some really interesting things out there around, like, if you take things out of standard English and put things into African American English or African American language. Some people call it a language, some people call it a dialect. I will use both words here. Um, and then ask kids for whom standard English is their first language or their only dialect that they speak. They score how folks who were raised speaking African American language or African American English, it flips. So we see this complete flip in these intelligence courses. It's about understanding the ways in which words are used, because it's not about not getting what people are saying. It's just this word doesn't mean this, or this grammar structure doesn't mean this. And once it's actually put into a different language, shockingly enough, white folks do really bad on this when we're looking at when we're not using standard English. There's also these, like, when it comes to kind of embedding this just beyond the eugenics of intelligence and the white supremacy of intelligence generally, defining sexuality in this way really is based on a determination of who is valuable as a human being, and then actually depending that on their ability to align with normative ideas of what intelligence is. So, like, language and grammar policing, can we just please stop? Can we just please stop? Framing of white authors or ideas or of the academy as like the best or the most intelligent. I don't know how many of you have been forced to read. I mean, there are many college students in this audience, I'm sure. So many of you have probably been forced to read a whole lot of really shitty white authors and go, wow, that was a waste of 3 days of my life that I will never get back. Or we're told you should go read Jane Austen. You don't have to read Jane Austen. Don't read Jane. You don't have to read Hemingway. You don't have to read any of these fuckers. Unless you want to get a sense of like what is embedded as weirdly pretentiously intelligent, apparently. It also centers neurotypical folks and folks who communicate in neurotypical ways. People who use middle and upper class English signifiers, things like, well, as I was considering that, or when I thought more deeply about that, or considering blah, 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 then this happened. We can all say all of these words and they mean absolutely nothing, but because it clues to middle and upper class language standards, people read that as sounding intelligent. Mm-hmm. And if you also this is also about people whose first language is your own language, right? Generally standard English, and people with a certain kind of education and a certain kind of expertise and all of this bullshit that you do not know when you look at someone, but you are reading into it based on how that person looks. And then you are using this as a justification for continuing to align with these very normative ideas about what is attractive. And it's bullshit.
Yeah.
That was a rant.
I love your rants. It's so fun to have your rants in person. It's also hard for me because we're looking this way and I'm used to like looking at you on Skype.
I keep wanting to do this. I could just like turn the mic.
Yeah.
I don't know. No, but then I'm not looking at y'all.
You have to, yeah. We'll look at our wonderful audience that we can barely see because of the lights.
Yeah,
so I think when it really gets into this, what it's about is it's about power, and it's about who has the power to define what is intelligence and what is smart, right? And so people who are identifying within this are also subtextually saying, I get to define what's smart and what's not
Mhm.
smart, and whoever connects to me or says interesting things to me, or who has similar types of interests or intelligence as I do, is smart or is valuable in that way, right? And so it's not that you can't want a connection with people or that you can't
Mhm.
desire having an emotional connection first, because that is how I engage with people. I really do need an emotional connection with somebody. I really do need to feel like I can talk with somebody and feel really deep with somebody. But it's less about that being a problem and more about tying it to these systems that come from, like Jay mentioned, white supremacy, that come from ableism, and that really come from this idea that there is a specific type of unique intelligence that is a scale you can rate people on, or that is able to be translated across different languages, different communities, different understandings of who humans are. And
Mhm.
so really what we want to challenge folks to do is think about, what do you mean when you're saying sapiosexual, if that's how you identify? What do you actually mean? Like, what are you trying to connect with people? Do you need an emotional connection? Are you trying to find people that have really similar interests to you, right?
Mhm.
All of that stuff can be in your attraction without using terms and frameworks that come from these really bigoted places, right? Um, and as we're going to talk about later on in the show, right, there's no bad people. Like, you're not a horrible person if this spoke to you or if this is something that meant something to you. But we're also going to help offer challenges and ways to think about that in a different way, or things that you may have not even considered in what you're saying when you're doing that. So
Yeah.
summary, any other stuff you want to?
No.
Don't use sapiosexual to get into queer
Oh
spaces if
God,
you're not a
please
queer
don't.
person. Just don't.
Please don't.
That's the big takeaway here. So,
Queer spaces or queer pants.
or queer pants, yeah,
Don't do it.
don't do it.
It's gross.
Queer pants deserve better. So we're gonna do a really short Patreon break, because usually we have a stinger and stuff, but we have a Patreon. It's how we support this show. We're not gonna spend too much time on it, but I just want to let folks know that one of the reasons we do that is because being supported by people who listen to the show allows us to say things like "fuck capitalism."
Mhm.
It allows us to say things like "sex toy companies suck ass."
Oh,
It
many of them
allows,
do.
and not in the
Yes.
fun way.
No.
It
No.
it allows us to really speak about things in the way that we want to and not feel like we're going to money out. A lot of times it means that people end up in these really compromised deals where they have to push capitalistic products that they may not even personally believe in, personally use, or really care about that much. And so we're grateful to the folks who support the show and make it possible for us to not have to do that.
Yeah.
So thank you.
So yeah, if you can support us with money, that's amazing. And if that is not an option for you right now, that's okay too. Please spread the word, and also go to Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app and rate and review us. Give us a 5-star. Give us a sentence. We love reading them, and they really do help people find the show. They're also just a nice little lift when we get to see them, and we like to know, how this is impacting people and if it is being helpful or not.
Yeah. There was one person who gave us a 3-star review because they said Jay talked over me. And I'm like, I think I talk over Jay most of the time. But, give us 5 stars. It's much better.
I mean, it's up to you.
So,
Sarah, you have a tour date coming up.
yeah. So I will be at Southwest Love Fest, which is a polyamory centered conference that happens in Tucson every year. I will be there from the 2nd through the 5th.
Of April.
Of April, yeah.
Not
April
March.
April 2nd through April 5th. I am presenting one of those days, but I don't remember which one right now. But I'm going to be doing a workshop on dysphoria and sexuality and navigating that as a trans person or as a partner of trans people. And it's going to be a really fun workshop. I've done this at a conference 2 times before, and it's always been a really great a really great conversation. So if you're going there, I would love to see you. And if you're not, think about going there this year or next year. I really love Southwest Love Fest. I've been to a lot of kink and sex and polyamory conferences, and it's probably my favorite one that I've been to. It's just a really fun environment. So yeah.
Also, we still have tour dates available for our 2019-2020 tour, and we are booking for 2020-2021. So send us an email at queersexed@gmail.com, and we'd love to come and see you.
Yay.
All right, we're done with that now. Thanks for the stinger again, love.
You're welcome. That's what I'm here for.
That is not what you're here for.
Well, that and the show, I guess. So up next, we're going to talk about dating preferences. We already, like I said, got started on sapiosexual, but
like dig into it, tear it apart.
We already ranted on sapiosexual.
It's
Now
true.
there's more to rant about, and it's called dating preferences. So we want to start this by saying there's a difference between not feeling attraction to somebody based on your individual compatibility or claiming, excuse me, there's a difference between not having individual compatibility with somebody
Mhm.
and claiming that you aren't attracted to an entire race, an entire body type, an entire nationality, or other physical or socially identified traits, right? And so, what we're going to do is dive into the difference between those and also maybe help you dive into your own experiences of if there are things that are showing up in your dating life, if you're only dating people who are of the same race as you, or if you're only dating people who look very similar to you, or you're only dating people who are skinny, or you've never considered dating a trans person or anything like that. Um, it's important to dive into those things and really ask like where's that coming from for you and what makes you uncomfortable about
We were considering pulling up some of the comments that have been left on Sarah's "It's transphobic if you to say you will not date a trans person" article, which is not the title. I am totally
it.
misremembering the
No,
title. I'm sorry.
it's transphobic
Why
to
is it
say you
transphobic to
don't
say?
date
Yeah,
trans people, something like
yeah.
that.
And then we decided that no one actually needed to air that ever, and no one needed to hear all those delightfully violent
No,
microaggressions.
but I get lots of
Um,
notifications still from this article I wrote like 3.5 years ago that are like people being like, "Ah,"
I'm like,
and
I think you just read the title.
yeah.
I'm not a transphobe. You definitely just read the title.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah. I also wanted to say, like, the goal of this isn't to say that, like, you have to be attracted to everyone, or you have to be interested in dating everyone, or you have to have sex with everyone. Please don't have sex with anyone you don't want to have sex with. Please don't date anyone that you don't want to date. Like, that's cool. This is not about trying to, like, prove how woke you are by, like, doing that. It's about looking internally and going, whoa, I am saying like, all right, I'm rejecting large swaths of people, or I just don't find these kinds of bodies attractive. And where is that really, really coming from? And it's often coming from the reality of growing up and being raised in oppressive situations and being socialized with certain values and beauty standards and associations between identity, how something looks on a body, and whether or not that's considered beautiful. Um, Beauty standards change across culture, across history, around the world, simultaneously existing. And they have shifted in some predictable and some not predictable patterns. I also do want to point to a really excellent book by Sabrina Strings called Fearing the Black Body, which is about the racialized construction of fat phobia and thinness as American exceptionalism. That really digs into how this particular vision of conventional attractiveness was built as a white supremacist product and
Yeah.
project.
Yeah. So don't date anyone that you don't want to date. Don't have sex with anyone you don't want to have sex with. That's
No.
not the point of what we're talking about here. Um, and it's important to also mention that like marginalized people don't exist just to like be your learning experience, right? Or to like be your like way of exploring yourself or whatever, right? Like that's very dehumanizing. So it's it's one thing to like look into yourself and wonder like why do I have these before? Maybe you've never dated a trans person before. It doesn't mean to like go on OkCupid and like just search for fat people or trans people, right? But it more means that like work on yourself to be more open to that in the world and you will probably find those connections in a natural way that doesn't require finding people or forcing them to really be your like diversity check mark.
Yeah, men on Grinder don't understand this.
But didn't you just get a message today that's like I want to date a trans?
Oh no, it was I'm curious about fucking a trans. It was not
Ah,
dating a trans.
even
It's
worse.
always and a trans. It's like thank you for that.
We want to start this by saying that this is to help you dive into your own experiences and your own biases and programming and bigoted attitudes that you might have, and that Jay and I also have, right? So we're all born into a racist, misogynist, fatphobic, transphobic, and classist society,
Ableist,
ableist, queerphobic, um,
ageist.
where advertising, media, our families, our friends all shape what we see as beautiful and as attractive and as interesting and worthy of dating, right? And changing these behaviors and attitudes isn't an easy thing to do. And the work is always ongoing, right? There's always more to learn, there's always more to explore, and there's always more to transform within yourself. Um, Starting from a place of bigoted beliefs about dating or about bodies or about attraction doesn't mean that you're bad or you're wrong or you're an evil person because we all start at that place, right? We're all born into a world that tells us that thin, conventionally attractive whiteness is what we should try to attain. And if we can't get there, we should try to get as close as possible, right? This is about really blowing that apart and breaking up the idea of what we consider attractive
Mhm.
or what we consider worthy of love and romance and dating.
I mean, this is why things like the Black is Beautiful movement is revolutionary, why reclaiming indigenous body modification and beautification practices and standards is revolutionary because it is directly against and undercutting all of this cis heteropatriarchal capitalist white supremacist ideas of what bodies should be able to do, shouldn't be able to do, what is attractive, what is not, what is valuable, what is not, which also has been really embedded in science. And I know many of you have heard me go on about the bullshit that is social Darwinism and evolutionary biology. Here's another opportunity to hear more. Um, we tend to start with, oh, this is how people are doing this. Therefore, it must be a biological drive. Therefore, we now must prove it with science. Or it's been socially constructed like literally every other part of our lives, which again, social constructionism is not to say that things don't act like they're real. Money is socially constructed. We still got to pay our bills, right? Gender, race, sex, class, ability, all of these things are socially constructed. Disease is socially constructed. Based on interpretations of things that bodies do or do not do. It doesn't mean that bacteria don't exist. It just means what illness is and how we construct it is a medical construction.
Right, the difference between how we think about HIV or pneumonia, like the example you said earlier today, right? Those are things that affect the body in ways that are difficult and that you have to cope with, right? But one of those has stigma and shame and violence and a lot of like health marginalization attached
Mhm.
to it, and one of those is just like a thing you go to the doctor for, right? And so why aren't both of those a thing you can go to the doctor for? Well, because of bigotry, right?
Yeah. Um, Yeah, and also like this stuff is really it's deep. And so even the stuff that we consciously reject, the things that we've been raised into believing are like wagon ruts for us to kind of fall back into when we're under stress or when we're feeling activated or when we're highly emotionally charged or when we're trying to make a decision quickly or when it's something that feels really close and individualized like an attraction that feels so close that like oh well this is just how things are and and this is still embedded by us.
Mhm.
And again, we're not talking about good or bad people. I'm not saying anyone is a good or bad person, but there are things that we can be more thoughtful about, and there are better actions that we can take.
Yeah. So as we're talking about this, pay attention to what it brings up in you. Pay attention to if something is challenging for you or feels like something that is resistive within you, because that's a pretty good indication that there's probably something there for you.
There's a there
And
there.
and you can use that as a way, kind of like when we talked about in our jealousy
Mm-hmm,
episode.
mm-hmm,
Like you can use the discomfort of jealousy to tell you more about what your needs are, right? Similarly, when you hear something that might be challenging your own internalized ideas of whether you're a good person or not, or about bigoted assumptions you might have, you can use that reaction to then teach you more about where that's coming from, right? And so we invite all of you to not feel like this is some sort of like attack or something that we're coming at you with, but rather we want to help those of you in the room and on the podcast, and also just Jay and I ourselves, kind of dive into like why do these dating preferences
mm-hmm.
exist? How do they show up? And how do they cause harm, right? Because really what it comes down to is how do we avoid harm? How do we avoid dating apps being a really dangerous place for trans people or for people of color or for people navigating those systems? And then why do we have to create separate, different apps that allow us to have safety when we could just do the social work to help make the world a safe place for those people instead, right? Not that people can't have their own spaces as well, but
Yeah.
um,
So let's just start with trans bodies because why not?
hey, that's
We'll
us.
just go there. And I want to name here like one of the things that always comes up for me in this is that when I was first coming out as queer when I was a baby 20 years ago, um,
A baby queer, not like
baby,
an actual
no, not an
baby.
actual baby. We'd have to go back significantly more than that, almost 40 years for an actual baby. I was coming up in a cis lesbian community that disparaged trans women so strongly that I internalized a lot of that shit. And so even though when I started dating a trans woman when I was barely 19, I had internalized so much shit. It really got in the way of our ability to sexually connect and emotionally connect for a while until I figured out what the fuck this was coming from. And where it was coming from was this idea of like, this is somehow undercutting my queer identity. Obviously not. I am, yeah. Anyway, and that this was like, and I was also worried about rejection from community, which was a legitimate worry because I lost my community in just because of who I was dating and who I was in love with. And then, then coming out as trans shortly thereafter, uh, yeah, that just exploded. Um, but I do want to thank Tracy for helping crack that egg. Good job. I appreciate you. We were not good together for a long time, and that's okay. I was a fucked up 19-year-old. But thanks for cracking my egg.
But now we're passing that on to crack many eggs with our show. So,
Yes. And apparently by fucking people.
Yeah, exactly. We want to say that it's okay that your sexual orientation might be a very important part of your identity and of your attraction.
It's a hugely important part of mine.
Yeah, and it's a big part of mine too, right? And so it's not to say that if we get rid of dating preferences, it means you have to be open to dating everyone all the time, or that you have to force yourself to feel attraction to somebody that you don't. That's definitely not what we're talking about here. But what we do want to help with is spending some time thinking about what attraction really means. And when you say sexual orientation, what do you actually mean by that, right? Are you really talking about just a set of genitals? Or do you mean your attraction to identity groups that are beyond that?
Yeah. And we wanted to stay with genital preferences for a second, because I think this is where a lot of folks kind of get stuck or tripped up, and I get it.
Yeah. A lot of the comments I get on that article are things like, you're homophobic because you're telling gay men that they have to have sex with vaginas or whatever, right? And it's like,
is this really just about people's bits?
Yeah.
Is that really what sexual orientation is? And so with genital preferences, like, some are absolutely about trauma. Like, yeah. And trauma is definitely one of the reasons that I have problems interacting with cis men. And I know we both have problems interacting with cis men, which is not to say that cis men are bad. It's just there's a lot of trauma there. And also, like, some of these preferences are about what you're used to, or some of them are about, what those parts have been constructed to mean to you. And maybe it's also like some things that certain sets of parts are more likely able to do is a really key part of your sexuality. Although I will say that, like, some toys and other parts may be able to do all of those things as well, in different arrangements and with or without assistance. And anyway,
well, and also someone with the genitals that you're imagining might also like not using those genitals, right? Or might want to use a strap-on instead because it feels more affirming for them or whatever else. Right?
Genitals are fun, is really the long and short of it there. Right. But so my question here really is always, like, how much of attraction is about gender and about physical pieces that you're like, oh, this is something that is really interesting, or oh, this person is really beautiful, and how much of it is about genitals, because we don't generally walk around without our pants off, or with our pants off, rather. We do walk around without our pants off. I feel like I may have been painting myself into a corner there of nudity that I do not aspire to. But right, with the exception of like nude beaches and sex parties and dungeons, like, that's not the first thing that you generally see of people, if you see it at all. So if we're saying, like, I'm not attracted to penises, or I'm not attracted to vulvas. I am using medical language here. Not that I particularly like it at all. Just as a general umbrella right now, if we're saying things like that, like, what does that actually mean? And what does that part mean? And what is it about then that you're taking that part and reading it on other parts of people's bodies to indicate that? And again, not saying that anybody has to have sex with anybody else because of their body parts. Like, trauma is real. What you are used to is real. Key parts of your sexuality are real. Like, what those things mean can get in the way of being able to engage with them, how you kind of internalize that stuff. And also, like, is this really a deal breaker? If this person is someone that you're really interested in, you're really attracted to, does the presence or absence of a dick? Because really, it's always about that, because penises are treated as fucking magic. And like they're fine, but like they're not any better or not than any other particular arrangement of genitals. But it's like this magical thing, right? And so presence or absence, like, is that really the thing that would make you go, oh no, I can't do this?
And similarly, if you were dating somebody and they happened to lose use of their genitals from disability, from being in an accident, from whatever else, right? Like, would that suddenly break your ability to feel connected to them? For some people, it
It
might,
does. Yeah.
and for a lot of people, it probably wouldn't, right? And so it's less like, what does attraction really mean, and is it more about the body piece for you, or is it actually about the larger identity where we've been taught to think of the body as a shortcut for that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, for example, does your attraction to men include being attracted to trans men, right? It doesn't mean that if you're only attracted to women, you have to suddenly add attraction to men to that in order to like not have dating preferences, right? Um, Similarly, if you're attracted to women, are you including trans women in that attraction for you, right? And then also, what do you assume about trans and non-binary bodies, right? Oftentimes, we see somebody in public and we read them as some sort of gendered body. Oh, I skipped.
You're
Okay.
fine. I'm just marking.
Oh, we already talked about
We
that.
did.
That's why. Thank
Hmm.
you. You tried to help, and then I just made it a big thing, and it's really awkward. So thank you. It's doing a live show is a thing because like I usually edit out all of the awkward moments where I don't understand what Jay is doing, but now they're all here for the world to see. Non-binary people blow up this idea of binary attraction, right? So when we're out in the world, usually we're gendering bodies and we're seeing them and we're sorting them into usually male and female, or male, female, and and
Let me
so
look. Let me look again. Let me look
right.
again. Where I'm just like, who is this beautiful person?
and
I
so
like your gender.
And so what it comes down to is you don't really know somebody's identity until you talk to them, right? When you see them, when you're looking at somebody and that initial attraction happens for you. If it does, I want to say that like for some asexual people, for some people who are on the arrow spectrum, like it might not happen for you in that way,
Hmm.
and that's okay too. But when you see that person and you feel attraction to them, you don't actually know their identity, and you might just be reading them as within your attraction sphere when they may not be within that, or they may be, and it might actually challenge your own ideas of what your attraction really is, right? So that attraction to somebody doesn't magically disappear just because you learn that the person is non-binary or trans, right? But that discovery might challenge your own conception of your sexuality and gender. I know for me, for example, when I met the first non-binary person that I met, like I was very in a sort of straight mindset for myself at the time before I transitioned, and really thinking I was only attracted to women. And then I met a non-binary person. I was like, oh, huh, that's really cool, right? Like that idea that like I could be challenged in my own conception of who I am by somebody who's outside of that idea, right? A lot of our attraction is really based on this binary structure of men and women finding each other, or of men and women as sort of a pushback against that straight culture, right?
Which is not to say that queer folks are not legit. It's just the way that society is structured is that we don't exist.
Yeah. That's what I meant to say, of course.
We are anomalies.
Um, so
I'm
it's
happy to
not.
be an anomaly. Can we
So
go back
yeah,
for just a
yeah.
second?
Go back.
Because I want to go back to like for a second about like if attraction is to men, does that include trans men? Because I really want to just track this down for a second because there's often like and I know that there's a really lovely meme going around to this effect, which I think you've posted at least twice. I tend to not post a lot of memes. I mostly post really, really depressing uh, things about white supremacy. Um,
It's important
it is.
to know.
It's what I do. So if we're like, well, I'm not interested in bodies that don't have this sort of genitals. Well, there's plenty of folks who are trans who have the set of genitals that you're looking for. Well, but I don't want them if they're like this. Well, there's people like every kind of exception that you can come to is basically like, but we're not a monolith, so that there are folks that will fit into that. And as you get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, it just becomes really clear that you don't have anywhere to go and that this is just about something else. So what else is the there,
Yeah.
right?
It's usually trans people are yucky and I feel uncomfortable
Yeah.
about them.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. It's just like, is this really just about like this internalized bias, right? About like, and it's again, you may not consciously believe this at all. There's implicit shit that we don't even realize is there. That's like trans people are less real, or trans people are icky, or weird, or gross, or strange, or unnatural or whatever it is that is so embedded that you don't even realize that it's there. It just comes up with, oh, I've just never met a trans person I'm attracted to, or I don't date trans people.
Yeah. So the kind of takeaway from this section is it's not transphobic to not be attracted to one specific trans person, right? If there's a trans person in your life and you don't feel attraction to them, that's okay. Um, but it is transphobic to say, I don't date trans people. I'm not attracted to trans people. I don't find trans people interesting, right? Because what you're doing is you're taking an entire group of people and you're then making an assumption based on one piece that you have decided is not okay for you, and then painting everybody with that same brush, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what usually ends up happening when you have those attitudes is then you do meet a person who's in that category, and it forces you to challenge your idea of, oh, maybe I actually am feeling attraction to this person. And maybe my ideas about what was possible are really different, right? Similarly, you might be somebody who thought of yourself as straight your entire life. And then you meet somebody who's a man if you're a man, or a woman if you're a woman, who's non binary, and forces you to really challenge your idea of like, oh, I really thought this identity was really solid for me, but actually it turns out maybe I just hadn't met the right person of this group yet, or whatever
Mm-hmm.
else, right? And so we have this idea that like some fallout of the sort of like born this way, like arguments around gay marriage and gay rights and not being killed by police and all this other like shit that we've had to fight for as a community that Pete Buttigieg is fine throwing away. We
Just gonna slide that in there. Just gonna,
I got our Pete episode will be next
go
week
there. It will
actually,
be.
but
Let's get to the judge
but
and quit
you know,
LGBTQ.
so
Um,
but like we've had to fight for these things, and part of that is because we as a community have been marginalized in the past, right? But um it's it's not a problem to not have an attraction to one specific person, but when you're writing off an entire group of people based on that, then it is really based on these people are uncomfortable for me, or I find them gross, or I find them
yeah,
icky. And that's really much more problematic.
yeah. And all this shit is built on white supremacy and colonialism. Like every one of these fucking systems of oppression has been built on this. The ways that we define gender is built on this. Also, want to call up a really another amazing book that I'm currently in the middle of, called "Black on Both Sides." That's about that's about race and trans identity, and how transness has been built uh, into and on top of white supremacy as a thing, because of the ways in which we conceptualize gender as inherently related to race, and that white femininity and white masculinity are identified in these very, very separate ways, because of these fucking systems. So, right, we can definitely like then see how all of this other stuff is built, right? So there's this I have this lovely mug, which for a long time was my profile picture on FetLife, um, because FetLife is trash, and people don't get to always just see naked pictures of me. That was more fats, more femmes, and so this is one of those things that has also been really, really common to see on dating apps. Grindr is particularly bad about it. I don't know why I keep torturing myself with Grindr, except to bring you all Grindr Peace Theater, because it's hilarious what people think is okay. Um, but we continue to see kind of no fats, no femmes. So this like scapegoating and throwing away of femininity, particularly femininity in men, and also of fat bodies. And additionally, right, there's also all of these ideas like, oh, I'm just not attracted to Black people. I'm just not attracted to Asian people, as though all Black people and all Asian people are all from the same place and all have exactly the same background and is just one giant monolith of an entire huge group of people. Or I'm just not interested in Indigenous people, although that's not usually the language that people who are saying that use.
Unfortunately,
I'm
no.
not going to use it. Or other things like, oh, well, I could never date anybody who uses a mobility device. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Where the fuck is that coming from? So particularly if you hold a privileged identity, although those of us with down identities swallow this shit whole too, because we're being raised into this. But if you have this a privileged identity, an up identity, and you're explicitly or again implicitly seeing groups of people as unattractive, unworthy, unvaluable, undateable, even if you'd still fuck us in secret, there are a whole lot of folks that are like,
did a lot of that,
oh, no
unfortunately.
fat, no
Yeah.
fat, no, really want to fuck fat women in secret.
Mhm.
Um, you are perpetuating white supremacist, cis, heteropatriarchal, ableist, classist, ageist bullshit ideas of beauty and what that means and who we really should value. And that's crap.
It's crap.
Because then it also shows up as like trans people saying, oh, I don't date other trans people. I'm just not attracted to other trans people. Oh, I'm just not interested in other trans people. And Black women and Asian men, because again of the ways that we structure gender and racial stereotypes around this, at these particular intersections that continue to just get pushed further and further and further out. And like there's some data from OkCupid for across 5 years, but then there's been more and more and more academic research around this, right? That like Black women and Asian men consistently receive the least interest and the lowest ratings by everyone.
Yeah.
Everyone. Because of this. And again, people are not a monolith. So when we start constructing this, what we really mean is my idea of beauty is not you. You are other than that. So now I am going to continue to project all this shit, but I'm not going to say that and just be like, oh no, I'm just really interested in blondes.
Yeah.
Some Black people are blonde.
Yeah. Sometimes too, what this comes from is fear, right? So it comes from or it shows up as like sort of, well, trans people are great, but like I wouldn't want to offend somebody. I wouldn't want to hurt somebody. I wouldn't want to like do something that's going to be hurtful
Then
to
don't
them.
be a shitty human.
And so a lot of times I understand where that comes from, but usually what it is it's a scapegoat for not wanting to learn and not wanting to improve and also not wanting to be accountable to the fact that we're all going to fuck up on this stuff, right? Like we're all going to have these attitudes that are bigoted or these things that come from places that we're not knowing about or come from these sort of societal structures, right? And so really what it comes down to is, can you be vulnerable enough to say, I haven't dated a trans person before. I'm really attracted to you. I really like this connection that we have. And I want to let you know that I want to do the best I can with this. I'm going to do what I can personally to read, to learn, to do whatever. But I also want you to call me in on things when you feel like I've missed something or you feel like I'm centering cisness or I'm hurting you by saying things that are cis sexist or whatever, right? When I started dating my nesting partner, Nikki, we really did have to work through a lot of this stuff as a trans person and she's a cis person. To the point where like I before her had dated so many like bad cis relationships that I was just like, I'm done. I'm okay. I'm just only gonna date trans people from now
You
on.
were
It's
in
fine.
so
Like
many toxic cis with so many toxic cis women before we got together.
yeah. Well,
and when we first got together, oh my god.
and for a lot of people, I was their first trans partner. And I'm challenged by that sometimes. And how much emotional
I'm not
labor
interested.
and how much emotional labor really has to go into helping people see what they don't see, right? Helping people understand what they haven't understood yet, right? And so but similarly, I made a connection with somebody who happens to be a cisgender person, and it was a really great connection. And so what we did was work through that and understand the power dynamic of the fact that like she's going to bring stuff into the relationship that she's not even aware of, that she's not understanding, right? And there were times where she said things that were hurtful that we, had to work through and say, here's, I know what you meant with this, and here was the actual impact that you had, and helping understand like why those things were hurtful, and then also her doing her own work, and also talking to Jay because Jay offered to be a helpful person when I like didn't have the emotional capacity to really do it, right?
Meta more power.
Yay, metamors. But like this stuff is messy sometimes. Like if you're dating somebody who's really different than you, then things are going to come up, and especially if you're somebody who holds more privileged identities, you're going to hurt that person in ways that you're not intending, right? And so again, this isn't about being perfect. This isn't about knowing everything all the time, and it's also not about like forcing yourself to seek out things just to prove that you can or to treat it like a bingo card or something, right?
I do sometimes feel like people have like a bingo card of like, I'm going to date one Black person, and now I have dated a Latinx person, and now I'm going to date a trans, and then I am going to find a queer, and then I am going to find a disabled, and then I am going, and now I have bingo. I don't know what you win when you win woke bingo other than my hatred.
They should be so lucky.
Probably just my indifference, which I feel like maybe hurts more.
Yeah.
My disappointment and indifference is
Right.
what you win. And I also want to name that like folks who are marginalized communities, folks with those down identities, right? Like we, depending on how those show up, And obviously, all of us have some assortment of up and down identities. We may not be open to connection with privileged folks with the up identities for very different reasons. Like, I'm just tired. I'm just tired. And like, I am willing to fuck cis people if they meet a bare minimum of not grossness. Um, but I'm just not interested in investing a ton of energy into dating cis people because of how much it can take out and how much education has to go into it and how much coddling sometimes feels in the like. And if they're looking for comfort from me, like, no, fuck you, it's not going to happen. Go find your shit somewhere else. Um, and that's different, right? That is a different thing. That is why we also find like spaces for particular community to connect. This is why we try to build out some of those things. And so there's really a difference between kind of like saying, yeah, I'm attracted to you, and you're too much work for me to be able to do this for whatever reason. I don't have the like, yeah, I'm not going to hold your hand through your identity crisis. So like figure that shit out and then maybe we can figure something out other than banging. Um, once, probably once. Although again, every cis, heavy air quotes on that person that I have fucked up to this point has since come out as trans and non-binary. So cracking eggs or being contagious, it's one of the two. Maybe both. But I know that we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of these safety boundaries and how those kind of show up for us. And I started to, but do you want to?
Yeah, I just thought it might be helpful to give some examples because sometimes hearing this, the reaction can be like, well, there was a time as a white person that a person of color didn't want to date me or whatever, right? And like, how does that fit into this too, right? And so that's different when we're talking about marginalized identities who've been harmed by power systems may have to draw a boundary for their own safety or for their own ability to navigate the world in a way that feels safe for them. To say like, you know what, I really just can't do this right now. For me, I'm a survivor of sexual assault from a man in my life. It was somebody I was really close to. It was somebody that I trusted, and it was a really deep violation of that trust in a way that's made it really hard for me to connect with men beyond that, right? And so the importance of that is to say like I'm realizing that it's my responsibility to do the work around why this trauma is hard for me, around why I need to draw this boundary right now, or why I haven't found a man who's been a good fit for me recently. Um, and also realize that like there were times where I was harming myself by forcing myself into sexual relationships with men, because I felt like I had to prove that I could do it, or I felt like I had to prove that I could force myself through it, or whatever else, right? And so um, there are times where people might have to draw boundaries around safety stuff. Like Jay was talking about genitals too, right? Like you might have had something happen with a certain type of genitals that was really triggering for you. And when that comes up for you, it might bring that back up, right? And so this isn't an absolute, right? We're not here to like give you rules about what you have to do or don't have to do around dating, but more just to ask questions about if there's something coming up for you where you don't feel like you can connect with people who are within your attraction sphere. I can tell when a man is hot. I can tell when I'm attracted to a man, but I just don't want to go further than that right now. And so that's different than saying all men are disgusting or all men would never be with me or I can never do that or whatever, right? Because as a pansexual person, as a queer person, like they're in my possible sphere of attraction. I feel myself physically attracted to them at times, but emotionally and mentally, it's much harder for me to find a safe way to do that, right? And so the onus isn't on those men to then prove all the time that they're good or whatever, right? The onus is on me to negotiate my trauma, to figure out where it's coming from, and to be just open to the fact that there might be a man in my life who might be a good fit for me later on, right? And not force that to happen because I feel like I have to prove that I can do that necessarily.
Yeah, and for me, this shows up in a couple of ways, particularly like, T for T forever is, I should just get that tattooed on my body somewhere probably.
You should get T for
But
T. That'd
T
be
for T
cute. Yeah.
forever. Crash, my nesting partner, now has a T for T stick and poke tattoo. And to not act on those attractions because I'm tired, because I made some choices to be embodied in the ways that I present myself to the world so that I'm not only more comfortable in my body, although the world is scary and awful sometimes, but also to be a really visible trans person because I want to be that person that frankly I needed to see when I was younger and would have figured this shit out and maybe felt better about my life. But to be able to see like, a disabled, queer, trans, bad person. And so I want to be able to do that. And because of that, I'm educating cis people constantly. And so then I don't want to do it in the bedroom or in the time when I can like turn off from professional mode. I don't want to have to be like, and now we're fighting about this shit around your comfort again. Cool, this is fun. This is not what I need right now. My standards for hooking up are significantly lower than my standards for ongoing interaction with people because of that. And then this also, though, shows up for me around fat bodies. I love fat bodies. I am so very attracted to fat people generally. And there is so much internalized shit around that for me that it shows up in really toxic ways that can hurt my partners when my self-hatred about all the shit that I've internalized around my fat body comes up. And they're like, well, that's how my body looks. Like, what are you then saying about me? Mm-hmm. When I'm not meaning to say anything about them, but just simply mentioning it and knowing that I'm holding that absolutely shows up like that and lands in those ways. And that's really fucked up. And this is constant unlearning and constant challenging.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is kind of how it shows up for me.
I had to do some relearning around fatness too. Like I think I had internalized a lot of really negative message about fat phobia from my family, from just like the culture that I was in. I'm in a state where there's a lot of like thin white people. And my school was very much that as well. And so I had to really unlearn these ideas of like that fatness is inherently bad or gross or negative or dangerous or something to avoid or whatever. And also that it wasn't attractive, right? It actually turned out that once I started dating fat people who I loved and who I cherished, and I could find the joy about a soft belly, or the joy about like holding someone who has a lot of body to them, or about feeling somebody close to me and feeling all of my skin on their skin as a fat person with a fat person, right? A lot of my dating before was like being much bigger than my partners because I didn't feel comfortable dating people that were my size, right? And so these are things that we're all working on, right? These are things that come up for all of us. And even if you're somebody who's a sex educator, even if you're somebody who's been talking about this stuff for a while, it's going to come up for you, right? So it's not about shame or about being perfect all the time, but it's about questioning where do these things come from, and also how can we work on transforming them.
Yeah, let's dig that shit out.
Yeah. So we would like to move on to the question and answer part of the show. If you have a question about what we've been talking about, you're welcome to ask that. But also, we just want any questions about sex, about gender, about sex toys, about safety, about consent, about
the history of queer criminalization in
America. Yeah, anything.
That was a 2-part episode.
Anything that you're interested in, you should have a slip of paper, right? Papers. Did the papers get passed out?
Okay, there's a box moving around. Okay. I'm also gonna go grab this mic.
Yes.
And if folks want to come
and
up,
we'll get the mic as well.
Or would somebody be willing to walk the mic around? Is my other question. Awesome,
okay, thank you so much. Thank you. You stand up for a sec. Yeah.
Oh no, I'm just getting the mic.
Oh.
But I needed to push my pelvis doesn't work.
And I will say too, if you're watching live on YouTube and you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and we will also get to that as well. Somebody said they were wondering why there hasn't been an episode posted in February, because I've been really depressed, and because disability stuff is hard, and because I had to see the doctor a lot, and the doctor brings up a lot of stuff. So we try to make things weekly. We now have this episode plus the recent episode that we recorded last week in the hopper. So we're going to get back to posting weekly episodes. That's always our goal. So anytime that we don't post a weekly episode, I'm going to try and communicate about that better on our Facebook page and on our Twitter. But I also just want to share that like there are going to be times where we can't, and unfortunately that's just the reality of being two poor disabled queers who are not paid professionally to run a podcast by NPR or something, you know.
I don't want to work for NPR.
I also like co-host the show, but then do the editing and all the transcripts, and so we don't have somebody else to do that, unfortunately. So
somebody would like to help us with our transcript archive. We would love it.
No, I don't want somebody else to do it until I can pay them. So that's really my concern for that. We've had people say they want to do it on a volunteer basis, but that feels unethical to me. So, do we have a question in the audience, or questions in the question box?
You have to hold the button down a lot. It comes on eventually. Did I get that?
Oh,
I should not.
There we go.
I I love that this is a Kleenex box.
Okay, so if somebody has a question they want to ask now, Jay, do you want to start sorting through those?
I am opening them up and yes.
Okay, cool.
Making pile.
Question from the audience? Okay.
That is blank and that is blank. I'm just digging out the blanks.
Yeah, so hi. This is mostly related to some of the stuff around sapiosexuality that came up earlier, and specifically around intelligence being as shitty as it is. I am disabled in more than a couple ways, some of it visible, and I have a lot of trouble like explaining various things, but especially how much like intelligence stuff hurts me to partners, and I like don't always know how to get through that because some of it is just I don't always have the energy to like talk that out with someone, and then also like linking them like a blog post that I've already written about this or that someone else has written is like comes across as passive aggressive. Sometimes it feels like it does, and I'm like I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As a prolific link sender to people, I want to validate that like it's okay to not have the energy to do that education. And I think maybe framing it a little more, like thinking about how you would want to frame bringing it up to somebody, might help sort of get rid of those feelings of like I'm being passive aggressive, right? Because a lot of passive aggression is about like saying one thing and meaning another, right? It's about saying like you look great when actually it's so supposed to, you're supposed to understand like that outfit looks bad, right? Like just say the outfit looks bad if you think it does, right? Or whatever, right? And so um, giving a little more context about like, hey, I'm really feeling attracted to you. I really like our connection. I really want you to understand why what you said before was hurtful to me or whatever, but I don't have the energy or I've already written extensively about it. And I would love for you to read this because in some ways that can be a check for you also to be like, is this person willing to invest the time and energy to really like love you and to cherish you as you are and to really understand why things might be hurtful, or are they kind of seeing you as disposable and they're like too much work, right? It might be a really telling reaction for you, even though it can be difficult to navigate sometimes.
Yeah, and also like the work is never on should never be put on the person who's being targeted, right? So like in some ways I have this like, well, what are they gonna do if I'm mean to them? They're gonna go, man, I'm gonna go, okay, block, bye. Or they're gonna be like, oh, you're so awful, I never want to be in community with you. Okay, I'm not missing out on anything, right? So it's just this kind of like, and I realize that like in being able to like find community and connect with people, like that can get hard. And if it's a relationship that you care about and want to invest in, like that's one thing, right? Like, you know, you're a friend or like I'm attracted to you or I want this relationship to continue and holy shit, you keep doing this stuff. Like you gotta meet me at least halfway or we can't do this. But if it's like rando on the internet, like fuck you if you're not gonna read this shit. And it's gonna hurt your feelings. Like, but it's not on me to make you feel better. Or again, to hold your hand through your fragility.
Yeah. It's like how much does the relationship mean to you and where is it coming from, you know? And yeah.
And like if they actually care about the relationship as much as they think they should, then they should be able to do some work. Also, like please stop using people as Google is really the other thing. But I just like we all need to stop using each other as Google. We can Google and then we can talk about things.
Yeah. Well, some of too, like as a disabled person myself as well, like some of like what I need from partners is to understand that I have different ways of communicating, or is to understand that like it might be better for this person for us to have a face-to-face conversation, but I will not be able to do that, right? And so some of it is about setting your own boundaries around like what you really need, and like I mentioned before, like it might be telling for you if you set a boundary with somebody and they're like that's too much work, then that tells a lot about like if that person's willing to invest in you. Do you feel like that answered what you were getting at, or do you have a follow-up question?
No, that answered it. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to?
You can go for it.
Okay. I'm gonna read this one, and folks can think about what they want to ask as well if they want to ask on mic. So it says, without knowing how each of you identify racially and socioeconomically, the way each of you speaks signifies some level of privilege. I've never heard of sapiosexual, and it seems pretentious. How do you talk about these topics without sounding like a rich white authority?
Mm.
Um, so we both have white racial privilege. That is part of how we show up in the world. It's part of how we do this work. One of the goals that we bring to wanting to do this show is as white people speaking to white people about these topics in a way that can hopefully help push them towards further justice work and also to guide them towards articles or books or other things written by people who are not white to help round out that understanding for them.
Mhm.
But yeah, Jay and I, in some ways, have access to the work that we do and the language that we use because we both have been in formal systems of education.
Mhm.
Jay works at a college. I worked at a college before the work that I do now. I worked at a very white nonprofit before that. And yeah, our and sapiosexual might be something that's just like not in your communities or not something that people are using, and it is a pretentious word. Like,
I mean, honestly, like that whole first section, I would have been totally fine with. Sapiosexual is pretentious as fuck, and we can just give it up and move on. And also, like, I want to check where that comes from in me, and like throwing things immediately away or kind of having this black and white thinking, which is definitely something that whiteness was trained into me around. That there is correct and there is good and there is bad, there is right and there is wrong. There's nothing in the middle. You have to pick things. And no matter how many times my not great mother would say, "Oh, but there's shades of gray," she never lived that way, and so I was never taught to live that way. And so I have this impetus to just be like, "Yeah, it's bullshit." And like sometimes that is a good thing because yeah, a lot of things are just bullshit. And in the ways in which people kind of come to figuring out who they are, this might be a path for that. And I don't want to just say, "Well, you're somehow less than." And it is pretentious as fuck.
yeah. I also want to speak to like the white authority thing. Like, um, there might be things that we say or do that are coming across that way because it's an unconscious bias within us, or it's the way
Yeah.
that we've been socialized to speak or to explain things. But I also sort of wonder, like, what does it mean to be a white authority? Like, what does it mean to embody that in spaces? And I hope that what we bring is um, being able to talk to complicated issues, being able to use the experience that we have to educate and bring experience in a way that is free, that is accessible, and that is a larger platform for other folks to then become inspired to do their own work or to find their own community resources as well. Um, but the reality of the positionality of Jay and I is that is sometimes what's going to come off for us, and that's our own work to do as well. And also, we're very open to hearing call outs and call ins either to the email or here if you want to catch us afterwards and let us know if there was a way that we've impacted you or harmed you with the language that we're using, because we do want to work on being better around that and learning ourselves and understanding that this is always a process.
Mhm.
So
And I fuck up constantly.
yeah.
Um, and try to do better tomorrow.
Are there other cues in the Q&A?
There was a lot of empty little sheets in here.
Okay.
So that was the only one that I saw. I'm going to double check,
Okay.
but I think that might have been the only question in the
Audience
box.
question? Somebody else have something they want to ask
Or
in the
anything on
audience?
YouTube?
Nope,
Nope.
nothing on
Okay.
YouTube right now. Yeah, do we have one over here, Maria? It's more for accessibility around the room for people to be able to hear. And also I think it'll help it show up on the recording a little better.
Yep.
Nothing else? Okay.
That's
Hi.
great. Hello.
I kind of just have a question about like the polyamory thing.
Mhm.
You guys mentioned you have nesting partners,
Mhm.
and I don't know anything about that, and I would love to hear.
Yeah. So I use nesting partner in the way that like people might colloquially use like wife or like a person who's like an important live-in partner who is there for the majority of my life. Um, I don't tend to use that language as much, and use nesting partner instead, because it helps communicate that I have other people in my life who are also important to me, but in just really different ways, right? So because I live with my partner Nikki at home, we see each other, 95% of the time. She's watching this and is very sad that I'm not at home right now, because she would want me to kiss her. But
That tracks.
very much. But the relationship I have with Jay is going to look really different than the relationship I have with Nikki. But because of how I experience my polyamory, it doesn't mean either of those relationships is more or less valuable to me or is more or less important. But nesting partner allows me to talk about the amount of time that I'm spending with that partner, and also the dynamic that we have of living together, without putting the sort of like hierarchy on it that sometimes that language can imply. Not that polyamorous people can't say wife or husband or can't say other things as well, but there's a little more cultural baggage to unpack there around the idea that, like wife and mistress have really different power ideas of like how important those relationships are, right? Although I do love
One of
being the
them implies
consensual mistress.
illicitness.
Yeah. I do
You
love being the
do.
consensual
You do.
mistress. I'm like, oh yeah, come over. Everyone knows what's going on. And then we'll have sex, and then I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, and just the like reality of kind of like when you are engaged in multiple relationships, there's not really good words for that, right? And so there's been some really interesting things kind of within, um, for between folks who are practicing non-monogamy or ethical non-monogamy or whatever they want to call it, or polyamory, and talking about like, well, nesting partner, we nest. We've built a nest together. We live together. And maybe there's, a lot of people who live in that. Maybe there's a polycule of nesting partners that live together. I guess a beaver dam would also work. It's also something you build, but we often talk about nesting. There's folks that talk about anchor partners, so kind of longer term, usually important relationships that are kind of anchoring in your life. I've also heard things where people just like put colors or like random letters or words or something to a partner, so that there is not a hierarchy, which is not to say that some folks do not practice hierarchical polyamory or non-monogamy, because folks definitely will have primary, secondary, tertiary. I don't know what comes after tertiary.
Quad
Something. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. We're not going to try. Right. And that is a structure that works for some people. It does not work for me. Sarah, I consider an anchor partner, also a podcasting partner, like a thing we do. Is it growing? I don't know.
It's growing. Don't worry. It's growing.
It's terrifying. Anyway.
Jay doesn't look at the stats. I do
not
because
look
it
at
makes
the
Jay
stats.
uncomfortable.
Makes me nervous.
Jay's like, 4 people are listening to this. It's great.
Fine. It's great. I can see kind of people in the audience. Yeah. So, as folks who are practicing, I call myself a relation anarchist, and a non-hierarchical polyamorous person. I have lots of important relationships in my life, and they're not necessarily sexual or not. They're not necessarily folks that I live with or not. They're not necessarily folks that I have, that I even am able to see, touch, or talk to every day. That doesn't mean that they are less important than other folks in my life. It means that we have different relationships. And so being able to kind of talk about that in ways that doesn't immediately imply hierarchy in standard English is useful. So yeah, that's kind of where that is coming from. Is that answering your question, making sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
Follow-ups, etc. You can also
Follow-ups?
send the box back around.
Yeah. They can be about anything.
Okay, cool. We'll send the box back around.
Do you have a question you'd like to ask, Maria? Okay. Yeah,
Awesome.
Sure. That's okay. If you really hate it, you can email me and I'll edit it out.
Totally.
Hello.
Hi.
So I am a public health student and I'm in a class on LGBTQ health, and we were talking this week about bisexual health disparities. And so biphobia in the LGBT community has been on my mind a lot this week, and it also came up for me a little bit when you guys were talking about preferences. And I think it's
Yeah.
something that comes up for me with my gay men friends and lesbian friends sometimes with like genital preferences and how strong that can come off and how exclusionary it can be for people who exist in the middle of the spectrum. So I was just wondering if you guys have thoughts on that, either like as it pertains to preferences, like we talked about before, or just like what the queer community can do better to stop being biphobic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that makes me think of is kind of this idea that like bi people are in limbo, right? That like they're waiting for the other shoe to drop to like either be really gay or really straight, right? Or even the idea that when you're a bi person in a relationship, either like one visible relationship as a polyamorous bi person or in like a monogamous relationship with one person, that your like bi-ness kind of just like goes away, or and it's like, no, like my attraction to people of different genders is still there. I've chosen to be in this relationship with this one person or to have my experience in this way, because I enjoy the connection I have. And so I think because we live in such a binary world, that binary isn't just in sex and gender, but it's in how we think about everything. It's this or that. It's this or that, right? And bi people exist in that space of and, right, in that space of really challenging the idea that your sexual identity has to be based on a choice between one of two things. And I think for a lot of people that's really uncomfortable. It's really hard to deal with. And especially to the health disparities thing, I think Jay can probably talk to that even more specifically around data stuff. But like we know, like bi women, for example, are more likely to be survivors of sexual assault, or are more likely to be in abusive relationships. We know that bi men have really high risk for other like mental health stuff that's really difficult, or suicidality or whatever, right? And so that stuff is coming from biphobia in society, right? And so it has a real tangible impact, not just in like decaying interpersonal relationships that can hurt, but also societally. We see bi people as either like disposable or as not choosing a side, in a really harmful way. And so I think the more we work on breaking down this idea of binaries, that we have to choose one or the other, or that we have to be one or the other of things, and really that things can be separate and valid outside of that, right? Like being bi isn't like being half straight and half gay. It's being bi, right? It's part of where that biphobia comes from, is people's discomfort with what it means to their own identities, or their own sort of fear of bi-ness challenging that.
Well, I think right. I think that the fear piece is something that I hear and see a lot around like, well, but what if they leave me for a insert other gender here? And it's like, then they started another relationship with someone of a different gender. Oh no! It doesn't mean that like suddenly you've like chased them out of their sexual orientation or their nascent straightness or queerness. Like that's not how any of this works. They're still bisexual or pansexual or queer, non-monosexual. And there is a threat, I think, to conceptualizations of own identity that some gay and straight folks kind of get locked into.